welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about maintaining a healthy lifestyle or a healthy environment, we look for balance.
Right, yeah. Nobody wants wild extremes.
Yeah. Think about setting a thermostat in your house. You want it right around, a comfortable 72 degrees.
Yeah.
Not too hot, not too cold.
It is safe. It is entirely predictable.
Yes, and sadly, that is how many people approach their spiritual lives. We want a comfortable 72-degree religion.
We want enough warmth to feel cozy, but we certainly do not want enough heat to actually catch fire.
Spot on. A controlled climate. We avoid extremes because extremes make us, and honestly, everyone around us, very uncomfortable.
Yeah, they do. But then, you open up the pages of history.
Oh, man. Yeah.
And you read the words of men and women who just completely shattered the thermostat.
And suddenly the idea of a comfortable religion feels like a tragic compromise.
Yes. We are looking at a spiritual landscape today that is often freezing cold.
Right, and the solution isn't to bump the heat up a few degrees. The solution is a roaring, all-consuming fire.
So true.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are investigating a text from the 19th century English bishop and writer J.C. Ryle.
Our incredible thinker.
Yeah, we are looking at his classic work, Practical Religion, specifically focusing on his exposition of Galatians chapter 4, verse 18.
Which states, it is good to be zealously affected, always in a good thing.
Right. And our mission for this conversation is to investigate the true nature of Christian zeal, learn how to spot its very dangerous counterfeits, and understand the massive weight this characteristic holds for your daily life as a believer.
It is such a vital mission for you to hear. The text was written to strike a blow at what the author called the lazy, easy, sleepy Christianity of the 19th century.
Sleepy, yeah. And if he thought the 1800s were sleepy, man, one can only imagine the critique of our current era.
I know, right? The writing forces us to look this concept squarely in the face. It strips away all the modern sensibilities that prefer religion to be polite and, invisible.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. Because when you hear the word zeal, or especially zealot, it usually carries a harsh negative connotation.
Oh, absolutely. People instantly picture a guy screaming on a street corner with a megaphone.
Yeah, or someone who cannot hold a normal conversation without making it awkward. But the definition we are looking at today frames the subject completely differently. So what are the actual parameters here?
Well, true religious zeal is defined in this text as a burning desire to please God, to do his will, and to advance his glory in the world in every possible way.
Okay.
And here is the crucial distinction. This is not a natural human trait. You are not born with this.
You cannot manufacture it by reading enough motivational books or attending seminars.
Right. It is a specific desire placed in the heart of a believer by the Holy Spirit at the moment of conversion.
So it is not about having a type A personality.
No, not at all.
It is not about naturally being a high-energy person who drinks, 6 espressos before noon.
Right. You could be naturally introverted, quiet, and physically frail, and still possess a roaring fire of spiritual zeal. It is an imparted grace.
That makes so much sense.
The text argues that while every converted believer has this desire implanted in them to some degree, some feel it so much more intensely than others.
And they are the ones who truly deserve the title of a zealous individual. They feed the fire, whereas others let it dwindle down to embers.
Yes. And there is this specific phrase used in the source material that I just cannot stop thinking about.
Oh, which one?
A zealous person is described as preeminently a man of one thing. They are swallowed up in one thing.
Swallowed up. Wow.
Yeah, if they have health or sickness, wealth or poverty, praise or blame, none of those external variables matter.
Because if they are consumed in the burning, they are entirely content. They're acting as a lamp made to burn.
That lamp imagery is so striking because it illustrates the cost.
Right, because a lamp's entire function, its only reason for existing, is to provide light.
But to provide light, the wick and the oil must be consumed. The zealous person understands that their life is the fuel.
They are indifferent to the circumstances that obsess the rest of us,
Yeah.
Our comfort, our reputation, our financial security.
They view all of those things as secondary or even tertiary to the single goal of pleasing God. The burning is the point.
It is like observing an elite Olympic athlete or a tech startup founder. Think about those individuals for a second.
Oh, yeah. They are intense.
They abandon sleep, leisure, normal social relationships, and physical comfort for a singular secular goal.
Right. A swimmer will eat plain chicken and broccoli for 4 years.
Yeah, and stare at a black line at the bottom of a pool for 6 hours a day just to shave 1/10 of a second off their time.
It is wild.
So what happens when we take that exact same obsessive, singular focus and direct it vertically toward honoring Christ?
Well, the fascinating outcome of that vertical focus is that a truly zealous individual will always find a sphere to act.
They do not wait for ideal conditions.
Well, yes. They do not say, well, if I had a larger platform, or if I had a theology degree, or if my church had a better budget, then I would do something.
They figure out what they have access to, and they use it immediately.
They find a way. If they cannot preach, they will give money. If they lack funds, they will pray and intercede.
The text paints this really vivid picture of a pauper, someone utterly destitute, lying on a perpetual bed of sickness.
Yeah, from a worldly perspective, that person is useless. They are a drain on resources.
But through constant, fervent prayer, that bedridden believer can make the wheels of sin in their community drive heavily.
Like throwing sand in the gears of the enemy's machine.
Yes, I love that imagery.
The historical comparison used here is Moses, Aaron, and Hur on the hill during the battle with Amalek in the book of Exodus.
Right, Joshua is down in the valley swinging the physical sword, doing the visible, bloody fighting.
But Moses is up on the hill, and as long as his hands are raised in reliance upon God, the Israelites prevail.
So the zealous person who cannot hold the sword in the valley will find a way to hold up the hands on the hill.
Spot on. And because this intense, single-minded focus is so striking, it really helps to look at historical evidence of this mindset in action.
The text definitely brings the receipts, looking at both the secular world and the spiritual realm to prove that this specific habit of mind is the secret to greatness in any field.
Yeah, the source material lists several massive secular figures to prove the point. Consider Alexander the Great.
He conquered the known world before he turned 30.
Right. He didn't achieve that by living a balanced life.
Right.
Or Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, defying the Roman Senate.
Knowing it meant total victory or total destruction.
And Oliver Cromwell reshaping the political landscape of England.
And it is not just military or political leaders. In the realm of science, the text points to Sir Isaac Newton.
Oh, Newton is a crazy example.
You look at the historical accounts of Newton, and the man would literally forget to eat because he was so entirely consumed by mathematical problems.
He would sit on the edge of his bed for hours, half-dressed, just staring into space, working out the laws of gravity.
Or Galileo, who was willing to face the wrath of the entire scientific and religious establishment because he was intensely focused on the truth of his astronomical observations.
James Watt is another prime example mentioned. He is the man who perfected the steam engine.
Right. Watt faced financial ruin, constant mechanical failures, and immense personal stress.
But he cast aside all secondary concerns to achieve greatness in his specific lane.
We look at these people, these wealthy merchants, these scientists, these generals, and society applauds them.
We build statues of them. We write biographies praising their singular secular ambition.
But then the text challenges us. What happens when that exact same habit of mind is consecrated to the service of God?
To answer that, the author walks us through a hall of faith, starting with the Apostle Paul.
Paul is the ultimate case study of taking incredible earthly potential and trading it for suffering.
Yeah, Paul was a rising star in the first century. He had brilliant prospects as a Pharisee.
Trained under Gamaliel, who was one of the greatest minds of that era.
Paul held significant political and religious influence. He had status, and he gave it all up to preach the gospel to Gentiles.
He traded comfort for shipwrecks, beatings, starvation, imprisonment, and eventually dying by execution in Rome.
And his mindset was summarized in his own words. He said, "None of these things move me so that I might finish my course with joy."
He looked at his impressive resume and counted it all as garbage compared to knowing Christ.
And it wasn't just the apostles who possessed this fire. The text moves forward to the early Christians.
These were people driven to worship in dens, caves, and catacombs.
They lost their property and their social standing. The author mentions Ignatius, a bishop in the early 2nd century.
He cheerfully traveled to his own execution to be devoured by lions in the Roman arena.
He reportedly said, "Now do I begin to be a disciple of my master."
Wow. Polycarp is another powerful example from that same era. He was the bishop of Smyrna, and he was 86 years old.
Wait, let's pause on Polycarp, because the context of his death is staggering.
He really is.
He is an old man. He is brought into the Roman stadium, surrounded by a screaming crowd demanding his blood.
And the Roman proconsul actually tries to give him an out. The political pressure is massive.
The proconsul tells him to simply swear by the genius of Caesar and revile Christ, and he will be released to go live out his final years in peace.
The proconsul is offering a compromise that many today would take in a heartbeat.
Just speak a few words, appease the government, and go home.
But Polycarp's response shakes the Roman hierarchy.
He looks at the proconsul and says, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my king and my savior?
That is the fire we are talking about. He chose the flames over a comfortable compromise.
Unbelievable courage. And then the source material jumps forward to the Reformation. It highlights Martin Luther.
We often look at Luther as a towering historical figure, but we forget the sheer terror of what he actually did.
In 1521, he is a monk standing at the Diet of Worms.
And for clarity, the Diet of Worms was not a nutritional plan involving insects.
Right, no. It was a formal imperial assembly, a diet, held in the German city of Worms.
Right, thank you. So Luther is standing before Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most massive, wealthy religious hierarchy the world had ever seen.
The papal nuncio is there. The physical books Luther wrote are sitting on a table, and they are demanding he recant.
The threat of being burned alive is very real. They had burned John Hus at the stake for saying similar things a century earlier.
Everyone is telling Luther not to go. The psychological pressure must have been crushing.
But Luther's response, according to historical accounts, was that even if there were a devil under every tile on the roofs of Worms, in the name of the Lord, he would go forward.
He unveiled corruptions with an unflinching hand and preached justification by faith regardless of the anathemas hurled at him.
The text also brings it home to English soil, looking at the English reformers.
John Wycliffe, rising from his sickbed to oppose the corruptions of the friars.
And then there is Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer's story is incredible because it shows that this zeal is not about inherent human perfection.
No, it is a grace that sustains you even after colossal failure.
Cranmer's narrative is intensely moving. The political pendulum has swung back under Queen Mary, and Cranmer was imprisoned.
Under immense psychological pressure and the terrifying prospect of a painful death, Cranmer broke.
He signed a document recanting his Protestant faith. He showed a moment of intense, understandable human weakness.
But then comes the public spectacle at St. Mary's Church. He's supposed to read his recantation publicly.
Instead, he shockingly revokes his recantation, declaring that his hand offended him by writing contrary to his heart.
When they rush him to the stake to burn him, he thrusts that very right hand into the fire first,
Calling it this unworthy hand, holding it there until it burned to a stump.
He was followed by Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley.
Latimer, standing on his bundle of firewood at age 70, told his friend Ridley to take courage, because they would light such a candle this day as, by God's grace, shall never be put out.
We also see the same fire in the Great Missionaries. The text points to Henry Martyn.
Here is a man who was the senior wrangler at Cambridge.
That title meant he was the absolute top mathematics undergraduate. He had won the highest academic honors available.
He could have chosen any lucrative, comfortable profession in England. He could have been celebrated in high society.
Instead, he turns his back on it all. He goes to India and then to Persia, translating the New Testament into Urdu, Persian, and Judeo-Persic.
He labored under harsh conditions, eventually dying an early death at age 31 in Turkey.
His entire motivation was a desire to see eyes of faith directed to the Redeemer. He wrote that he could bear to be torn in pieces and only he could hear the sobs of penitence from those he reached.
And yet, all of these men, Paul, Polycarp, Luther, Cranmer, Martin, they are reflections of the ultimate standard.
The text points us to Jesus Christ himself.
The Psalms in the book of Isaiah describe him as being clad with zeal as with a cloak. The zeal of his father's house literally consumed him.
If you trace the narratives of the four Gospels, from the cleansing of the temple where he drives out the money changers, to the agonizing prayer in Gethsemane, to the cross itself,
You see a life entirely swallowed up in the will of the Father.
Jesus said, "My meat is to do my Father's will and to finish his work." His zeal was perfect, unstained by sin, and totally focused.
Okay, we see this incredible list of figures, but I want to push back here.
Sure.
When we look at worldly figures like Caesar or Cromwell, that extreme singular focus caused massive destruction. It left fields of bodies in its wake.
Yeah, that is a dark reality.
Doesn't this kind of single-mindedness naturally breed arrogant fanaticism? If someone is so thoroughly convinced they are doing God's work, don't they risk becoming a wrecking ball to everyone around them?
That is the critical tension. It is a very real danger, and the author anticipates that pushback perfectly.
He does.
Yes, the text issues an urgent warning, comparing zeal to fire. Fire is an excellent helper, a wonderful servant, but a terrible master.
If you harness fire in a furnace, it warms the house. If it gets loose on the living room rug, it burns the house down.
Because of that destructive potential, we must urgently learn to identify the fakes. We have to learn the difference between true spiritual fire and a destructive counterfeit blaze.
It is noted that Satan is the master counterfeiter.
Wherever God mints a genuine gold coin of grace, Satan immediately floods the market with cheap forgeries to bring the genuine article into disrepute.
No Christian grace has suffered more from counterfeiting than zeal. People look at the historical wreckage caused by false fire, the wars, and the cruelty, and they conclude that all fire is bad.
The text outlines several horrifying examples of this false zeal, starting with a zeal that lacks knowledge.
So, I'm trying to picture what false zeal actually looks like functionally.
It is tough to spot sometimes.
Right, I was thinking it is kind of like an autoimmune disease.
Oh, wow. Yeah, okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, when the human immune system is healthy, it aggressively attacks viruses and bacteria to save the body.
Right.
But when it develops an autoimmune disorder, the energy and the aggressive response are still there, but it lacks the knowledge of what is actually a threat.
It gets confused and starts attacking the body's own healthy tissue. It destroys the host from the inside out.
That is a phenomenal comparison. The aggression is present, but the target is entirely wrong.
The text references the unconverted Jews of Paul's day. Paul himself writes in Romans that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge.
They were intensely religious, they fasted, they prayed, but their energy was aimed in the wrong direction, leading them to reject the very Messiah they were waiting for.
Or take King Manasseh in the Old Testament. He had incredible zeal for his false gods.
He was so dedicated that he literally sacrificed his own children, making them pass through the fire to Moloch.
Think about the psychological state required to sacrifice your own child. That requires a terrifying amount of dedication. But it is a zeal birthed in pure darkness.
The text also points out instances where someone has the right heart but takes the wrong action.
Think of Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. The temple guards come to arrest Jesus.
Peter draws his sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. He is trying to defend Jesus. He is zealous.
But Jesus rebukes him and heals the man's ear. The action was completely out of step with God's redemptive plan.
And history is littered with even darker examples. The author brings up the Spanish Inquisition.
The Inquisition is a textbook case of the autoimmune disease analogy. They would march men and women to the stake to be burned alive for reading the Bible or holding Protestant views.
They would solemnly call it an act of faith, an auto de fe.
They sincerely believed they were doing God a service by torturing people.
The text also mentions the Crusaders shedding blood across the Middle East, or Hindu widows voluntarily burning themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands.
It references the historical atrocities where Roman Catholics threw the Vaudois and Albigenses off cliffs simply for holding different theological views.
All of those people were in earnest. They were deeply serious, but their zeal was contaminated.
It shows that the human heart is so incredibly subtle that we can do the right things for the completely wrong reasons. Our motives get polluted.
The breakdown of these contaminated motives in the text is fascinating. First, there is party spirit.
You see this with the Pharisees. Jesus said they would cross oceans to make a single proselyte.
But they weren't trying to bring people to God. They were just trying to recruit for their specific sect.
They cared about building their own brand, increasing their numbers, and making the convert twice the child of hell.
Then there is pure selfishness. It is noted that sometimes it is socially or politically advantageous to be religious.
If a society rewards piety with power or patronage, you will suddenly see a lot of very zealous people.
The text points to Joab in the Old Testament, who served King David primarily for his own military advancement and survival.
Or the citizens in England during the Puritan Commonwealth who faked intense religion just to secure government jobs under Cromwell.
We also cannot ignore the love of praise. The example of Jehu is used here.
Jehu was commanded by God to put down the worship of Baal in Israel.
But as he is driving his chariot to go do this, he spots Jehonadab and says, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord."
He wanted an audience. He wanted someone to applaud his radical dedication.
If your religious activity requires a crowd to watch it and validate it, you are running on Saul's fire.
This brings us to a massive point in the work we are studying, and honestly, it feels like it was written this morning.
The author offers a scathing critique of a modern generation that makes an idol out of mere earnestness.
It is perhaps the most perceptive cultural analysis in the entire document. We live in a society that says it does not matter what you believe as long as you are earnest about it. As long as you are sincere, you are fine.
Right. People will excuse massive, catastrophic theological errors as long as the person committing them seems genuine.
They say, well, we shouldn't get bogged down in minute points of doctrine. They are an earnest person. They mean well. Let them be.
It is the idea that sincerity is the only virtue that matters. But the text tears this argument apart. Sincerity cannot replace truth.
No, it cannot.
It is like cheering for a marathon runner who is sprinting incredibly fast, pouring sweat, showing amazing endurance.
But they're running backward on the track.
Yes, the speed and the sweat mean absolutely nothing if the direction is totally false. You wouldn't hand them a gold medal, you would try to turn them around.
The historical record supports that logic entirely. The text defends the objective standard of the Bible. God has not left us to guess what is true. We have a written word.
If we elevate earnestness above the Bible, we are forced into ridiculous conclusions.
The author uses a sharp historical contrast, pointing out that Queen Mary was earnest in restoring the papal system, referred to historically as popery, and she was earnest in burning Protestants.
But Latimer and Ridley were earnest in opposing her. Are we really going to say that because both parties were earnest, both were right?
It is logically impossible. You cannot have two completely contradictory truths just because the people holding them really mean it.
God does not just look at the sweat on your brow. He weighs the motive of your heart and the scriptural alignment of your actions.
Mere sincerity is an idol. It is a vague, humanistic replacement for Christ. The author states he shrinks with horror from the theology that says a man cannot be wrong whose life seems right on the surface.
So, since sincerity alone is wildly insufficient, we have to establish the precise criteria for the genuine article.
If there are all these counterfeits, how do you know if the fire in your own chest is the real thing?
The anatomy of genuine zeal is broken down into 5 non-negotiable markers. And if any of these are missing, the fire is suspect.
The anchor of this genuine fire is that it must be according to knowledge.
True zeal is not a blind, chaotic frenzy.
It must be calm, reasonable, intelligent, and most critically, it must be able to show a clear warrant from Scripture for every step it takes.
It isn't driven by emotional whims, political outrage, or cultural panics. It is anchored deeply in the text of the Bible.
But knowledge can be cold. You can memorize the entire Bible and still have a heart of stone. So the text immediately pivots to the motives.
Yes, the action must come from true motives. As we discussed earlier with Jehu and the Pharisees, God considers the doer's heart, not simply the volume of work produced.
The author uses a specific term here, stating that if you are working from selfishness or a desire for praise, your work is reprobate silver.
Let's explain that term for a second. In metallurgy, reprobate silver is an impure metal mixed with dross.
It might look shiny on the outside to the untrained eye, but when the assayer tests it, it fails. It is useless currency.
And in the economy of heaven, work done for the applause of men is rejected currency. True zeal desires only the glory of God.
Building on that pure motive, the fire must also be aligned with God's mind. This means your energy is focused on the things that God actually cares about.
This is where it gets very practical. What does God care about? The text lists several things, starting with personal holiness.
The truly zealous person will view their own sin as the mightiest of all evils. They are willing to figuratively cut off the right hand or pluck out the right eye to avoid sin and walk closer with Jesus.
It's not just about fixing other people or winning arguments online. The fire starts in their own house.
Secondly, they burn with a desire for the salvation of souls. They want to bring people to the knowledge of the gospel.
Third, they stand against evil practices in society. The 19th century context mentions fighting things like drunkenness or slavery. They are jealous for God's honor.
And fourth, they fiercely maintain the doctrines of the gospel. They treat religious error like a deadly pestilence.
They guard the truth scrupulously, just like Paul did when he publicly confronted Peter at Antioch for compromising the gospel of grace.
But if you are so fiercely focused on guarding doctrine and confronting error, don't you risk becoming a tyrannical jerk?
That is the tension the author addresses next. How do you prevent this fire from turning you into an unbearable person?
That tension is resolved by the requirement that true zeal must be tempered with charity and love. It cannot be a bitter, fierce enmity against people.
The weapons of true zeal are spiritual, not carnal. The text paints a beautiful picture here. It says, true zeal will hate the heresy, but intensely love the heretic.
It will long to smash the idol, but it will profoundly pity the idolater. It speaks the truth boldly, but it always strives to speak that truth in love.
It warns people, but it does so with the tenderness of a nursing mother over her children.
And how do you sustain that kind of love when you are dealing with difficult people? The final marker is that true zeal is joined to deep humility.
A truly zealous person is painfully aware of their own shortcomings. They are not walking around thinking they are the greatest Christian in the room.
In fact, they are usually the last to discover the greatness of their own attainments.
The text notes that Moses came down from the mountain, his face physically shining with the glory of God, and he didn't even know it.
The author quotes Dr. Claudius Buchanan, a pioneer of modern missions in India, who genuinely believed he lacked zeal despite his massive accomplishments.
The text also quotes the great evangelist George Whitefield, who preached to thousands and turned multitudes to God, praying after 30 years of grueling ministry, Lord, help me to begin to begin.
Begin to begin. That reveals such a massive view of God's holiness.
And then there was Robert Murray M'Cheyne, the Scottish minister whose ministry left a massive mark on Scotland despite his dying at age 29.
M'Cheyne wrote in his letters, "None but God knows what an abyss of corruption is in my heart."
The truly zealous person is looking at the blistering holiness of God, and in comparison, they only see their own inadequacy. Where there is self-conceit and arrogance, there is no true zeal.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do you practically hate the sin with a burning passion, but genuinely love the sinner without softening the truth?
That feels like walking a tightrope in a hurricane.
It does. But the author uses a medical image that captures the balance perfectly.
The believer must be as decided as a surgeon dealing with a diseased limb, yet as gentle as a nurse dressing the wounds of a brother.
Let's test that idea. A surgeon cannot be sentimental.
Right. If they're operating on a gangrenous leg, they cannot say, well, I don't want to hurt the leg, so I'll just leave a little bit of the infection.
No, they have to be absolutely uncompromising, decisive, and ruthless with the disease to save the life.
But the surgeon is not angry at the patient. Their ruthlessness toward the disease is driven entirely by their compassion for the person on the table.
And once the disease part is removed, they switch roles. They become the gentle nurse, supplying the ointment, wrapping the bandages, speaking softly, and aiding the recovery.
That is what true Christian zeal looks like. Uncompromising on truth, ruthless with sin, but infinitely tender with the souls of men.
When this balanced, humble, and truthful fire is actually burning in a person's life, it produces massive ripple effects.
The text breaks these benefits down into 3 distinct domains. Let's examine how this fire impacts the individual soul.
The author compares spiritual exertion to physical exercise.
We all know that if you sit on a couch for a month, your muscles atrophy, your joints stiffen, you feel sluggish, and your overall health declines.
But regular exercise, even though it requires exertion, pain, and sweat, actually promotes vigor, health, and a feeling of well-being.
What exercise does for the physical body, zeal does for the soul.
So spiritual exertion actually brings peace rather than exhaustion.
The historical reality is that the Christians who possess the most joy, the most comfort, and the most peace are the ones who are constantly striving, working, and watching to extend the knowledge of Christ.
They live in the sunlight, so their hearts are warm.
Furthermore, the text points out a theological reality. While God loves all his children, he takes a special pleasure in those who burn for him.
He reveals himself to them in ways others do not experience. They get a taste of heaven upon earth.
But the fire does not stay contained in the individual. The second domain is what it does for the church as a whole. The text argues that zealous Christians act like salt.
Salt in the ancient world was primarily a preservative. It kept the meat from rotting.
A leaven of zealous Christians scattered throughout a church prevents that local body from falling into institutional corruption and spiritual death.
They're the ones who revive congregations when they are ready to die.
The author argues that if you look at church history, the men who left the biggest marks were not necessarily the smartest guys in the room.
Men of fire, like Latimer, Baxter, Whitefield, and Wesley, did far more for the church than men of superior intellect like Bishop Butler or Bishop Watson.
Which is saying something, because Butler and Watson were brilliant defenders of the faith. They wrote volumes of flawless apologetics.
But brilliance alone does not wake the dead. Fire does.
Wesley rode hundreds of thousands of miles on horseback, preaching in open fields to coal miners who had never seen the inside of a church.
Richard Baxter changed the town of Kidderminster through relentless, exhausting pastoral visitation, going house to house.
Their secret wasn't their academic pedigree, it was their burning zeal.
And this zeal is highly contagious. One awake Christian makes all the sleepy ones around them intensely aware of their own barrenness.
It is an unavoidable dynamic. If you put one thoroughly zealous man or woman in a dead congregation, they disrupt the status quo simply by existing.
The sleepy members might rail at them, they might try to pick holes in their conduct, they might view them as an oddity, like a new comet in the sky.
But insensibly, the zealous person does them good. They force the sleepy Christians to look in the mirror and ask, what are we doing? Are we just cumbering the ground?
Cumbering the ground. That is a reference to the biblical parable of the barren fig tree, right?
Taking up space and soil in the vineyard without producing any actual fruit.
Right. One person can open fountains of activity that would have otherwise remained sealed forever.
And then we reach the third domain. Zeal is good for the world. The text asks, where would the missionary work be? Where would the city missions and the ragged schools be without this fire?
For context, ragged schools were 19th century charitable schools dedicated to the free education of destitute children in Britain.
They were started by zealous Christians looking at the immense poverty, crime, and ignorance in the slums of London.
The author states clearly that governments and laws are entirely useless to fix the human heart. They cannot devise legislation to cure spiritual death.
The text operates on a specific theological framework here regarding human nature. It assumes that human beings are fundamentally broken.
A concept theologians refer to as total depravity.
This doesn't mean people are as bad as they could possibly be, but rather that spiritual deadness affects every part of a person's nature.
Meaning no amount of external government legislation or social engineering can generate spiritual life.
The government can perhaps restrain the outward expression of evil through the threat of the police force and prisons, but it cannot make a dead heart beat.
Only the gospel can do that. And the gospel is carried into the dark alleys of overgrown cities by individuals who do not sit around waiting for good works to become fashionable.
They do not wait for a committee to approve it, or for the culture to applaud it.
The text uses a military term. It says they go forward like a forlorn hope.
That was the term for the first wave of soldiers attacking a breached wall in a siege.
They knew they might not survive, but they went first to pave the way for the rest of the army.
Zealous Christians look at insurmountable odds. They look over the heads of the giants in the land, and they say, something must be done.
It is like dropping a single red-hot coal into a massive pile of freezing briquettes.
That one coal does not look like much. It is vastly outnumbered by the cold around it.
But the nature of fire is that it spreads. It heats the coal next to it, and then the next one. It inevitably changes the temperature of the entire pile.
The world owes a debt to Christian zeal that it will never fully comprehend until the final judgment.
It has checked crime, saved souls, and brought light to the darkest corners of human existence.
Knowing these vast, undeniable benefits, the author turns the corner at the end of the text. He stops teaching and starts preaching directly to the reader.
He issues 3 distinct challenges, addressing 3 different types of people. Let's look at his first appeal.
He speaks to the unconverted, or the person who makes no decided profession of religion.
And the approach is incredibly blunt. He asks them, where is your zeal? He points out the tragic irony of their lives.
They have abundant energy and passion for temporal things. They are zealous about reading the newspaper, checking their account books, expanding their businesses.
Or pursuing whatever the modern equivalent of Californian gold is. They will pour out their lifeblood for a career or a hobby.
But when it comes to the Bible, or the unsearchable riches of Christ, they have absolutely nothing. They are dead to it.
They are spending all their oxygen on things that will burn up in the end. The call to them is a stark, prophetic command. Awake, be zealous, and repent.
He tells them to look at the cross of Christ, to see the Son of God shedding his blood for sinners, and to never rest until they feel some zeal for their own eternal soul.
Then he turns to the second group, and this one stings. He addresses the lukewarm believer.
The person who is in the fold, but they are terrified of stepping out. The text suggests they are so afraid of doing harm that they never dare to do good.
He describes them as being rich in wet blankets, but poor in anything like Christian fire.
They will find 100 objections to any proposed good work.
If someone suggests a new ministry or a bold evangelistic push, they will list all the reasons it might fail, but they never offer a solution.
And he targets their financial giving. He critiques the miserable guinea subscriptions that they give to religious causes.
A guinea was a British coin. Giving a guinea subscription meant tossing a small, standardized amount to a charity, an amount the giver would never even notice was gone.
It required zero sacrifice. It was the 19th century equivalent of setting up a $5 monthly auto draft and thinking you have fulfilled your duty to the kingdom.
The author points out that these people look at false doctrine growing up in their own communities and they just wring their hands and wish it wasn't so, but they lift no finger to stop it.
They're burying their talent in the ground.
If a listener is auditing their own life right now, how do they determine if they are just throwing spare change at the kingdom of God versus actually spending and being spent for Christ?
The text answers that audit by pointing the listener to the urgency of time. It forces you to look at the clock. Life is incredibly brief.
The author points out to the lukewarm believer that in heaven there will be no ignorant people to instruct. There will be no unconverted souls to reclaim.
The window for works of mercy is closing.
The opportunity to pull a brand from the burning, to snatch someone out of the fire just before they are consumed, is strictly limited to the present moment on this earth.
Once you cross the threshold of eternity, the time for missionary work is permanently over.
The author quotes Bernard of Clairvaux, a medieval monk who noted a chilling reality.
Bernard said that Satan will rise up in judgment against many people at the last day, because the devil showed vastly more energy and zeal to ruin souls than Christians ever showed to save them.
That should keep us awake at night. The enemy of our souls does not take days off. He is not lukewarm.
Which is why the call to the lukewarm believer is the same as to the unconverted: awake, be zealous, and repent.
He tells them to stop poring over their own inward conflicts and realize that while they're obsessively analyzing their own feelings, souls are perishing around them.
Finally, he turns to his third group, the truly zealous Christians, the ones who are already burning. What is the counsel for them?
It is a strong encouragement to hold fast. The author knows the temptation for the zealous person is burnout, or giving in to the relentless pressure from society and sleepy Christians to cool down.
He pleads with them, do not go back from your first works. Do not let your first days be better than your last.
He warns them that it is incredibly easy to catch a chill in this world, but much harder to impart a glow.
He tells them not to fear the reproach of men. When you live like this, you will be called names. You will be labeled a bigot, an enthusiast, a fanatic, or a fool.
The advice is simple: heed it not. Those titles have been given to the best and wisest people in history.
If your zeal requires the world's applause to keep burning, it will extinguish the moment you face opposition.
And he leaves them with a quote from a Jansenist, a Catholic movement known for its rigorous piety.
When this man was told by his friends that he was working too hard, destroying his health, and needed to take a rest, he replied, "What should we rest for? Have we not all eternity to rest in?"
It is a total perspective shift. The rest is coming. The Sabbath rest for the people of God is eternal. But this current life is the battlefield.
It is the workday. We are to give, teach, visit, and pray, as if we're doing it for the very last time.
Let's pull all of this together. We've covered massive ground today.
To summarize the thesis, genuine Christian zeal is a singular burning desire to please God.
It is carefully guarded by scriptural knowledge. It is fueled by pure, unselfish motives.
It is wrapped in a thick blanket of charity and love for others. And it is grounded in painful humility about one's own sin.
It isn't a personality type. It is the natural byproduct of a heart that has truly seen the cross of Christ.
It is the only rational response to the gospel.
And I would leave the listener with this final thought to mull over. If your specific spiritual fire right now could be seen as a physical flame, what would it look like?
Would it be a raging bonfire warming everyone around you, pushing back the darkness?
Or would it be a flickering match, barely alive, about to be blown out by the slightest wind of worldly distraction?
Take a hard look at your life and consider what specific daily habits are draining your oxygen. What are you allowing to extinguish the flame that Christ lit within you?
That is the question we all have to answer. You cannot just set the thermostat to 72 and hope for the best.
Thank you for joining this deep dive into the source material. Keep pursuing truth, keep blowing on the coals, and we will catch you next time.